but I will start recording it. Thank you. All right, and if you guys in class see a chat that I missed, then let me know, because it doesn't show up on my iPad. So if I'm walking around, I won't see it on my iPad. Okay. All right, so let's see what you guys said here. All right, so yeah, most of you are saying E. Well, most of you, about half of you are saying E, which is true. It's the largest pure endocrine organ, right? So that would be one that doesn't include any exocrine functions or any neuroendocrine functions like we talked about, thyroid. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about first, is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is right in front of the trachea. Okay, so it's right here, and it has these two lobes to it. Okay, we can see it right here. Okay, it's made up of these little structures that kind of look like a raspberry, right? If you've seen a raspberry, it's kind of like the inside of a raspberry, and that raspberry, the raspberry shape is just covered in blood vessels. Okay, so it's a very, very highly vascularized organ. Okay, and so very high blood flow. And there's two main types of cells. They're follicular cells, and this thing is called a follicle. That's why they're called follicular cells. So those are the kind of purplish or bluish ones there around the little raspberry shapes. And inside of that chamber, there's a little chemical stored there called thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is really the precursor to the thyroid hormones. Okay, we can't store the thyroid hormones in their full form because they're not water soluble. Okay, or not lipid soluble. Okay, and then we have these other little cells that we can see here. Okay, these little tiny other little spots of cells called the parafollicular cells. And those ones produce calcitonin, okay? So there's really only these two hormones we're going to talk about. Well, there's two called the thyroid hormones, and then there's the calcitonin one as well. Okay, so the follicular cells, those purple ones, the more prominent ones, those are the ones that make the thyroid hormones. And then these little tiny ones, the ones that would be with A here, those ones would be the parafollicular cells. Those are the ones that make calcitonin. So B is the follicular cells. And C is just kind of the open space where we store all of that thyroglobulin before it is going to get released as the thyroid hormones. Okay, questions on that so far? All right, so let's talk more about the thyroid hormones. There's really two of them called T3 and T4. You can definitely know them as that. You don't have to remember these full names because they're really long. But one of them has 3 iodine molecules and one of them has 4. Okay, both are different versions of a modified amino acid, thyrine. Okay, and so iodine is a very important part of our diet because of these two hormones. Okay, does anybody know any sources of iodine? If you guys are on Zoom, send it in on the chat, or if you're here, what do you think, Brett? Yeah.
Concentrated cranberry juice.
Okay, concentrated cranberry juice. I wasn't aware of that one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, what else? Go ahead, Emily.
Salt noodles.
Let's say it one more time.
Salt noodles, like the seaweed noodles.
Okay, noodles. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that one either. What, is it the noodles itself or the broth that they're in?
And also the seaweed.
The seaweed, yeah. And it's typically products that come out of the ocean that are going to be high in iodine, right? So fish, seaweed for sure, shellfish, and then just table salt too, right? Most of our table salt is fortified with iodine because it's such an important chemical for our health. Yeah, so we got a lot there on the chat too, seaweed, salt, definitely, yeah. Good, okay. So yeah, and here's an example of iodized salt, right? You probably see a Morton salt like this in the cupboard at home before, and a lot of them will say iodized right there. Okay, that just means we put salt, somebody put salt into that to make sure we get enough of it in our diet. Okay, all right. So we've kind of seen this hormone loop before because we talked about it in terms of the pituitary and hypothalamus's involvement in it, but now we're talking about it in terms of the thyroid's involvement in it. Okay, and this is the one example of a hypothalamus hormone that I want you to know, right? All the other ones I said you don't really need to remember those acronyms, but this one you do have to remember the acronyms, okay? And that's the TRH one right here. So that's the hypothalamic hormone involved in this, okay? So the hypothalamus releases TRH, that goes to the pituitary, that releases its TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, right? That goes to the thyroid, and then we get our T3 and T4 released. Okay, one of the important parts to remember about all these hormone loops is that there's always a stimulus, and that's one of the parts that students tend to forget to study when they study, is what actually starts this whole process, what causes the hypothalamus to release TRH. So it starts this whole thing, right? And the two that I want you to know here are either just low levels of T3 and T4, okay, or if you're cold. Okay, so T3 and T4 is one of those hormones, or those hormones that are always at a certain level in the body, right? Because we got to have these high to maintain metabolism. Okay, and so if they drop at all, then that stimulates this whole system to produce more. Okay, and then also if your body's cold, you want to increase your metabolism to make more heat, and so that's what we see here. Okay, so the big ones, the big effects of it: increase mitochondrial activity. So the mitochondria is making energy, right? That also produces heat when you do that. That's your metabolism, right? And then also increase protein synthesis. So really just activating your cells to work, right? Okay, and then very, very important for neural development. Okay, questions about this hormone loop here? Okay. All right, so hypothyroidism, if you don't have enough of these thyroid hormones, there's a couple of main causes of that. It could be that your TSH levels are low. Okay, if your TSH levels are low, then you won't be stimulating the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Okay, or it could be the thyroid gland is damaged itself. Okay, or it could be you don't have enough iodine. If you don't have enough iodine in your blood, then you can't make these hormones, because you need a lot of iodine to make these hormones. Okay, so that's why we iodize salt. Okay, so in developing countries, the lack of iodine in the diet is the leading cause of mental retardation, right? Because of this, because that neural development is a very important role of the thyroid hormones. So yeah, so that's a big issue in developing third world countries. Okay, but symptoms related to this would all be things related to low metabolism. Okay, so weakness, fatigue, you're cold all the time, you're gaining weight, and then a goiter. Okay, this is a goiter. This is obviously a super extreme example of a goiter, but a goiter is when your thyroid gland is just growing out of control. Okay, and so yeah, let's take a second and think about this question here. I'll go ahead and ask it on the poll here. I know some of you guys, I know you guys on the Zoom can't answer that one that way. But think about it. So why would no release of T3 and T4 lead to this? Why would it lead to a goiter? And you guys on Zoom, why don't you put it in the chat, but don't actually hit enter yet? Okay, put your answer in the chat. And if there's someone like right next to you that you want to talk to about this, you definitely can. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Is it doing that for everybody, or they just did it for you right now? Okay, it never did in the beginning either? Yeah. Okay, all right. Okay, well, just yeah, maybe just shoot me a quick email just after class just to remind me that you're here so I can get the attendance part. Okay, yeah, so everybody on Zoom, why don't you go ahead and hit send on the chat. Good, and then those of you in class, submit that if you haven't yet. Okay, all right, so most of you guys in class are saying D. We got a few saying some other things. So yeah, D, so the negative feedback loop is broken, okay? All right, so that's what most of you guys said. Thyroid gland tries to grow to take in too much iodine, definitely not. Too much TSH released from the pituitary, or the positive feedback loop is broken. What's causing the growth in the thyroid gland? What hormone causes the thyroid gland to grow? Let me just yell it out in here if you know. No, not growth hormone, good guess. TSH, right? So TSH is one of those trophic hormones that also causes a gland to grow, okay? But if we look back at our feedback loop here, right? This was the negative feedback, right? Negative feedback was provided by T3 and T4. So if we don't have that, what happens? The TRH keeps getting released, TSH keeps getting released, and just if we never have any T3 and T4 produced, then those other ones just keep getting released, right? And there's nothing to tell them to stop, because T3 and T4 aren't there. So that thyroid gland just grows out of control, and that's what causes the goiter. Okay, definitely important clinical application to remember. Questions on that one? Sorry about that. I got to lock that. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. If there's low TSH, good question. Yeah. And so Justin asked a good question for those of you on Zoom. I'm not sure you could hear it, but he asked if the problem causing the hypothyroidism is low TSH, why would that cause a goiter? And it actually doesn't. Yeah. So that's why it says there too. If low iodine, then we get the goiter. Yeah. So we only get the goiter if the problem is not being able to make the T3 and the T4. If it's just low TSH, then we wouldn't see the goiter, but it could still cause hypothyroidism because we don't have the stimulus to release T3 and T4. Great question to clarify that. Other questions on that? Yeah, go ahead.
So the actual growth of the gland is caused by too much TRH because you can't stop the feedback loop?
Well, the growth is specifically caused by the TSH. Okay. So the TSH is what causes the thyroid to grow. But we're also not, so the negative feedback goes to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So we're having too much TRH, really too much TSH. But it's not that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not getting the negative feedback. So that's why there's too much, but too much really just kind of means it's too much because yeah, we're not making those thyroid hormones, but yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. All right, so this is just kind of an interesting thing that came out last year that I added to this, but what some researchers noticed was that in a lot of paintings that depict like the manger scene and other things around Jesus's time, they noticed that people, shepherds in particular, typically were depicted with goiters, actually. And because it was so common for shepherds to be poor and to not have proper nutrition, that many of them lived with goiters. So that was just kind of an interesting thing. This is one of those incredible murals inside of a chapel in Italy. Okay, so then on the other side of things, hyperthyroidism, when we have too much thyroid hormone, okay? Multiple causes of this as well. So it could be a pituitary tumor, right? So if there's more cells making TSH than there should be, then we end up with more TSH, right? And that's what a tumor is, just extra cells in that area. So we could have too much TSH. We could also have a thyroid tumor. That would make sense too, right? The thyroid is just way too big. It's overproducing T3 and T4, okay? Also an autoimmune disorder called Graves' disease that stimulates more T3 and T4 production and release. Okay, so symptoms of this are kind of the exact opposite of hypothyroidism. Okay, so weight loss instead of weight gain, always hot and sweaty instead of always being cold, rapid irregular heart rate, nervousness, bulging eyes like this. That's only really the case in Graves' disease, not with the other examples. And that's because Graves' disease actually attacks connective tissue behind the eyes, and that's what makes them bulge out like that. So it's not really related to the thyroid part of this. Treatment of these is usually just to remove the tumor and then supplement hormones synthetically for the rest of the patient's life for the most part. So yeah. Any questions on hypothyroidism? They're actually somewhat common, both of these things, and a lot of people in society are constantly either taking thyroid medication or taking the medication. Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Do tumors usually cause like the damaged areas like overproduce or underproduce?
Yeah, it could go either way for sure. But if it happens to be a tumor in the group of cells that makes a certain hormone, then that hormone will be overproduced. But then a lot of times you get that one is kind of crowding out the space of another type of cell that makes a different hormone. And so then that hormone might be low while the other one is high. So yeah, it just kind of depends. Yeah, other questions on that? Anybody on Zoom, other questions there? Are there health effects in just blinking when somebody has hyperthyroidism? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Cole. What do you mean? You can unmute yourself and explain that a little bit more, Cole, if you'd like.
Yeah, like I mean, it's automatic for our body to, you know, to blink nonstop or like once every 3 seconds or however much it is. But if they have like if their eyeball is completely like protracted or like all the way out, wouldn't it be hard for their eyelid to blink?
Gotcha. Yeah. And that's really only in the case of the Graves' disease where you have that bulging eye. But I think the eyelids can still get around the eyes, still make it around. But it is a good question. If they're sticking out so far, can the eyelids actually make it around? I think they can most of the time. They're pretty flexible. But yeah, it's a good thought. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the other hormone released by the thyroid gland, which is calcitonin. Okay, calcitonin, we talked about this one a little bit already in another example that I used last class, but this is released again from the thyroid, but from those parafollicular cells, the different cell types. Its release is stimulated specifically by high blood calcium, okay? If you've got too much blood calcium, those parafollicular cells will sense this and they will release calcitonin. And now its actions have to do with some bone cells we learned about last semester. Okay, so there's 2 bone cells we learned about mentioned here, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Okay, osteoblasts are the ones that blast out new proteins. That's the way to think about it, right? They blast out new things. They add more tissue to the bone cells. Okay, so they build up bone, and osteoclasts break down bone. Okay, so if we have a hormone that inhibits osteoclastic activity and stimulates osteoblastic activity, that's going to pull calcium out of the blood and put it into bone, pretty much, and make sure that we're not adding more calcium to the bone. Okay? And so that's how that lowers our blood calcium. Okay. Funny part about this one is we don't really need it. It's not really used much. If in cases where the thyroid gland is completely removed, you don't have to replace this hormone. It's not needed. That is actually how they learned about. Well, we'll talk about that one in a sec. Okay, and then related to this is the parathyroid gland. Okay, so here's our big thyroid gland. Okay, and then we have these little dots of tissue on the posterior side of the thyroid gland called the parathyroid gland. Okay, it was discovered completely by accident with somebody who had or people who had thyroid problems that they had to be removed. And they said, all right, let's replace those thyroid hormones. We can do that, but then the patient still died. And they didn't know why. And it was because they didn't even know about the parathyroid gland and the absolute importance of your blood calcium levels and how important this parathyroid hormone is for that. Okay, so parathyroid hormone, or PTH, is the really controlling factor in your blood calcium. Okay, so its release is stimulated by low blood calcium, so just the other side of things. Okay. And then its actions are just the opposite of the last one. So it activates the osteoclasts and inhibits the osteoblasts. So if we're activating osteoclasts, that means we're breaking down bone, adding calcium to the blood. And then if we're inhibiting osteoblasts, we're just making sure that we're not pulling more calcium from the blood to add it to bone. Okay, and then it also acts in our GI tract to help us uptake more calcium. Okay, so the end result is we get more calcium in the blood, but also lower calcium in the bone. Okay. All right, so let's take a second here and look at this one. And you can kind of just fill this out on your own here. If you're in class here, feel free to talk to the person next to you and kind of fill this in and then answer this question here with the app. Okay. So yeah, if you're right here, talk to somebody. If you're right next to somebody, and again, if you're on Zoom, go ahead and just fill that out, and then I'll have you guys send that answer in on the chat again, but I'm just gonna have you all hit enter at the same time. So you're filling in what's going on here, filling in the stimulus, filling in the hormones, filling in the actions, and we're not really supposed to like group up, but you can kind of turn and talk to each other. Yeah. So maybe just the person right behind you. Let's do it that way. Yeah. But we're not really supposed to like get close, but you can at least just kind of turn your head and talk.
Wait, isn't the bottom one the parathyroid? Oh, sorry, the bottom section is bottom parathyroid.
Angeline, right? Yeah, good to see you. Yeah. Yeah, a couple of other people were saying that too. It must have to do with this geolocation thing that I enabled on. Just turn that off. It was a try, but don't worry about it for this time. Were you ever able to get in, or at the beginning? It just kind of kicks you out, yeah. All right, guys, on the Zoom, go ahead and send in your answer there in the chat. And then if you have, go ahead and answer it there on the app if you're still able to access that. I know a couple of people said they can't. It's also the first time me trying this with everybody accessing the Wi-Fi on their phones like that, so you could be having some issues because of that too if you're in class. Okay, looks like most of you are able to still get in. Okay, so most people here are saying A, and then on the chat, we've got mostly A as well. Sorry, it's not anonymous on the chat. Maybe I shouldn't show that, but okay. All right, good. So yeah, everybody's saying A. So question is, what would inhibit PTH release, right? So PTH is being stimulated to be released because of low blood calcium. So when blood calcium goes back up, that would reverse it, right? And that's the idea there. So this just uncovers these boxes here. So high blood calcium would activate the thyroid gland to release calcitonin, and then that would cause calcitonin to deposit the extra calcium in the bone, okay, by activating osteoblasts, inhibiting osteoclasts. The other side of this would be low blood calcium levels, right? This activates the parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone. That causes osteoclasts to degrade bone and release calcium into the blood, and then that would block the osteoblasts. Yeah, go ahead, Logan. Oh, for sure, yeah, sure. Let's get that over. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, still get that. Okay, any questions about those kind of two hormone loops there together, either there in the chat or even feel free to unmute yourselves if you're there on Zoom or here in the classroom. All right, give you another couple seconds to finish writing those down, and we'll move on. All right, okay, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so yeah, we can kind of just walk through this one together here. Which below are stimuli for the release of TRH from the hypothalamus, right? That was the one that eventually leads to the release of TSH from the pituitary, and then the release of the thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland, okay? So we talked about decreased body temperature being one there, right? If we're too cold, okay? And then we talked about low levels of those thyroid hormones. So A, D, and F would be the three there. That's getting back to the stimulus, right? What are the stimuli for each hormone loop? Make sure that you're aware of those for all of them that we talk about. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so we'll move on now to a next gland called the adrenal gland. Okay, the adrenal gland is found there's two of them, one on each side, found on the top of both kidneys. okay? Also known as the suprarenal glands, just because of that, on top of the kidneys, okay? There's two parts. The cortex is the outer part, which is all endocrine, and then the inner part is called the medulla, which is nervous system tissue, okay? We'll talk more about that one on the TBL day on Friday, because that one's part of the sympathetic nervous system, part of our fight or flight response, which is what we're talking about on Friday with the TBL day. And that inner part release epinephrine and norepinephrine. I just abbreviated them there. Okay, and so all of you have heard of adrenaline before, right? You got my adrenaline pumping. That's really the kind of the non-scientific term for epinephrine. And it's called that because it's from the adrenal gland, right? Adrenaline is from the adrenal gland. All right, good here? Everybody got that? Okay. All right, so the hormones that come out of the adrenal gland are really three main classes. And now we're talking about the adrenal cortex, okay? We won't talk more about the adrenal medulla today. The adrenal cortex, it produces and releases over 12 different hormones, so a huge endocrine gland, but there's three classes, okay? The mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadotropins, okay? Mineralocorticoids, the primary one we'll talk about is aldosterone, okay? Their job is to control mineral levels in the blood. Okay, and then we've got glucocorticoids, and the primary one is cortisol, and its job, the two jobs really, control blood glucose levels and to control our metabolism as well. Okay, and then lastly, the gonadotropins. These are known as androgens, mainly DHEA, which is just an acronym for a really long one that we'll talk about in a sec. These are all converted into either testosterone or estrogen after they're released, okay? Performance enhancing drugs, typically the ones that have been used kind of by baseball players in the recent history, you know, in the past 10, 20 years, most of those have not been testosterone itself. Most of those have been androgens of some form, like DHEA, that can be converted into testosterone later in the body. Because testosterone is much more powerful, but it's easy to be tested for in the blood, right? And that's why they were kind of using these other ones instead. So, yeah, go ahead.
Is something like SARMs safer as far as like repercussions that come from it versus anabolic steroids?
Which one?
SARMs or that's
It's a different androgen.
So I can't remember that. Like synthetic androgen.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe safer in some ways because it's not quite as powerful as pure testosterone, but there's also different side effects because you can see there, these things can be turned into testosterone or estrogen, right? And so some of the side effects of even steroid, I mean, of testosterone use can be like males growing breasts and things like that. Because even if you've got too much testosterone, your body starts turning it into estrogen too. But it's even easier to do that with androgens because they could go either way, really. So yeah, maybe not as dangerous, but definitely maybe just a different group of side effects. Yeah, yeah. So yeah. Other questions on that? So these are important for all of the sex-specific traits, and axillary hair, pubic hair, female sex drive. And then, yeah, all of this is kind of driven by the gonads. And we'll talk more about this starting on Wednesday with the male reproductive system, and then next week with the female reproductive system. Okay, and one thing about all of these hormones, real quick, is that these are all steroids, right? And so, as I mentioned before, when somebody says steroids, they're mostly talking about testosterone, but there's many hormones in our body that are steroids, right? You don't hear of people shooting up with aldosterone, right? Controlling those blood potassium levels like nobody else, you know? But, yeah, so cortisol is another one here, one of the three. We'll talk about them all, but cortisol, again, is a steroid, like I said. It's stimulated to be released by stress. We kind of already talked about this when we talked about ACTH, right? Circadian rhythm is a very important part of this. This is where we get some cortisol release in the morning to help us wake up, right? And so there's its actions, right? So lots of actions. This increases our blood sugar. That gives us more fuel available to deal with whatever stress it is that we're dealing with, right? But then this is a catabolic hormone, okay? So this is when if you're trying to get buff, you definitely don't want to be shooting up with cortisol. It's the exact opposite of testosterone. It causes protein to break down instead of protein to build up, okay? But it's still a steroid hormone, okay? Causes protein to break down, fat to break down, as well as glycogen to break down. But it's also a powerful anti-inflammatory. So when you hear about somebody getting a cortisone injection in a joint or something, that's a very common treatment for many musculoskeletal injuries. They're putting cortisol hormone right in there, right? And that suppresses the immune system and decreases inflammation, and that's why they're doing that, okay? But absolutely essential to life, okay? We don't survive without cortisol. Okay, so there's a couple applications. I already mentioned the cortisone injections one. Cushing's disease is typically when we have a pituitary tumor that is releasing too much ACTH. Okay, so then you get a cortisone overdose in your body, which leads to high blood sugar, muscle and bone wasting, and you get this deposit of fatty tissue as well as scar tissue kind of on your back. It's known as a buffalo hump, but it's just one of the signs of this Cushing's disease. So the reason this one's blocked out again is because you don't need to know that hypothalamic hormone there. Okay, questions on that one so far? All right. Okay, so we can kind of walk through this one. Go ahead. Go ahead, Amy. Yeah.
Can decreasing inflammation disrupt the healing process at all?
Yeah, for sure. Let me repeat that question for everybody on Zoom. She asked if decreasing inflammation, if that can disrupt the healing process, and it definitely can. And so it's kind of it's always a balance of that. I mean, even the reason you put an ice pack on an injury is to try to decrease inflammation, so it's kind of always this balance of letting the body do what it needs to do, but not letting it kind of overreact and cause chronic inflammation, right? And so a lot of times we have chronic injuries that are a result of just inflammation that's just kind of stuck in an area. And so some dampening of that is a lot of times helpful. But definitely if you get too many cortisone injections in one joint in a too short of a period of time, you can actually start doing things like tearing tendons, damaging joints. And that's more because of its catabolic effects, that the tissues in that area just start kind of deteriorating. And so that is common sometimes in professional sports when you've got multiple cortisone injections in the same spot in the same year. Sometimes they can have major injuries where they tear a tendon or things like that. So there's definitely pros and cons to it, but yeah, kind of done in moderation, it can be a really helpful thing, but doing it too much can definitely be problematic. Yeah.
At what point does inflammation become bad?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not necessarily one that's easy to answer for sure, right? It's kind of like always going to be different for every situation, every injury that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a good answer to that question. Yeah, it's a great question. And but yeah, for sure. Okay, let's talk through this one here, and we've kind of already walked through this. So the stimuli on the top here for this. So we've got just kind of that normal stimuli each day. We get it released in the morning hours. Okay, stress would lead to the starting of the system, as well as the sympathetic nervous system activates this. That's a part of the stress response, right? Okay, the hypothalamus is going to release its hormone. Okay, that's going to cause the pituitary to release ACTH, the one that we already talked about. All right, then the adrenal cortex is going to release cortisol. And then we get all kinds of effects here. We get the inhibition of the inflammation, and then we get all of these. Gluconeogenesis in the liver. What that means is we're breaking down glycogen, turning it into glucose, releasing that into the blood. Breaking down protein so we can have amino acids available for fuel. Breaking down fat so we can have fats available for fuel. This is pretty much just all an attempt to make more fuel available so you can deal with that stress. All right. Questions on that one? Go ahead, Jeff. The hypothalamic one? No, only one you need to know is the TRH one. Yeah, the rest of them you don't need to know. Yeah. Okay, All right, so let's talk about aldosterone. Aldosterone, multiple stimuli for this one, okay? It could either be this whole system we'll talk about more called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. If we have low blood flow or low blood volume, this stimulates our kidneys to release something called renin, okay? Renin is really more of a enzyme that's going to convert other proteins into other things, but really it results in angiotensin 2. Okay, we'll talk about that one in a sec. And then angiotensin 2 actually goes to the adrenal gland and tells the adrenal gland to release the aldosterone. Okay. High blood potassium directly stimulates aldosterone release, and then stress via the whole ACTH pathway causes aldosterone release as well. Okay, so then it's actions. 2 primary actions. We increase sodium and water reabsorption in the kidney, so we hold on to more sodium and water. That would help with the blood pressure part and the low blood volume part. And then we secrete more potassium. Okay, so hold on to sodium and water, get rid of potassium. Then the end result of that is higher blood pressure and more blood volume. Kylie's having a hard time hearing. The rest of you people on Zoom, can you hear me? Put your thumb up if you can hear me. Good. Okay. Sorry, Kylie. It's just you. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Maybe try to hop off and hop back on. That might help. Okay. All right. So next one. Well, this is kind of shows you the pathway, the hormone loop here, dealing with aldosterone. Okay, we can just walk through this one together. This just fills in what we had just talked about, right? So this one here on the low blood volume side, that tells the kidneys to release renin. Renin leads to the formation of angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 then goes to the adrenal gland and causes aldosterone release. So that's one stimulus. The other stimulus we talked about was high blood potassium, right? And then the other stimulus was stress. And with that stress one, that led to the release of ACTH, right, from the pituitary gland. And then that ACTH goes to the adrenal gland and causes aldosterone release. And then we get those effects that were on the other slide, which was we absorb and hold on to more sodium and water, but we get rid of more potassium. And then the end result is our blood pressure goes back up and our blood volume goes back up. So angiotensin 2 is actually the most powerful hormone in our body for controlling blood volume and blood pressure. And so it has lots of effects. You can see those here. It causes ADH to be released as well, causes aldosterone to be released. It actually is a vasoconstrictor, so it causes your blood vessels to shrink down. That would increase your blood pressure too. And it also directly activates your sympathetic nervous system. So this guy here is a very important hormone in controlling our blood pressure. So much so that the most common blood pressure drug on the market is called an ACE inhibitor. ACE inhibitors block the formation of angiotensin 2. So some of your parents or grandparents might be on a drug called lisinopril. Anybody heard that one? Or anything with an "il" at the end. That's an ACE inhibitor, and it's blocking the formation of angiotensin 2. All right, how are we doing? Questions so far on this? All right, guys. Okay, so just a couple more here. The pineal gland is this tiny little gland buried pretty much in the middle of our brain. There's all kinds of kind of mystic lore around the pineal gland. In kind of New Agey type religions, it's known as the seat of the soul and the third eye. If you Google it, you'll get all kinds of crazy stuff on it. But the one thing we know about it that's very important scientifically is that it's directly connected to the hypothalamus via directly connected to the retina via the hypothalamus, and it receives information about how much light you're taking in via your eyes and how much darkness. So you're kind of having cycles of light and dark throughout your day is kind of being monitored by this gland. And if you're getting kind of good amounts of each of those, then you get melatonin released in the evening, and this makes you want to go to sleep. Okay, and so some of you have heard of melatonin to help you sleep. You can take it as a pill, right? But we actually make it normally as well, and it's stimulated by having some bright light during the day, and it's really important for regulating our circadian rhythm. So it's also important for that cortisol release in the morning too that helps us wake up. Okay, and it'll probably just take a minute or two to finish these last two slides, so let's go ahead and do that instead of continuing the recording. So the thymus is the second to last gland here, which is large in kids, shrinks down real small in adults. It releases one primary hormone called thymosin, which is very important for regulating our immune system and developing our immune system. So kids are developing their immune system, and so they need a lot of it. With adults, we're not doing as much development of the immune system, so it shrinks down to almost nothing, but it's really big in kids. And yeah, this one, let's see which of the, let's talk about this one at the beginning of class next time. If somebody reminds me, I'll put this up on Wednesday as a little bit of a review. Okay. All right, guys, good to be with you here today, and we'll see all of you on Zoom here on Wednesday, and then everybody that's here, see you guys on Zoom on Wednesday. All right, have a good day, guys.